this topic. And so the question was, where did the Canaanites come from? But I think even as a broader topic, like really who are they in general, and a real brief overview biblically, which is like ridiculous to ask, but
a little bit.
Yeah.
Is this on? I don't think we're on. Am I on? Am I on? I'm on. Okay. All right. No, that's a good question, and it's actually related as a nice segue into the topic tonight, actually, because Canaanites will come up. Here we go.
Get back on your pedestal.
Back on the pedestal. This is the Taylor spot. Okay. Canaanite is a word that the Bible uses as early as Abraham's emergence into the land as a generic term, a general term for the indigenous people already living in the land. When Abraham gets there, it's a term used for the indigenous peoples who are living there when Moses and then Joshua get there. And it's a term that's continued to be used for these indigenous people who are still there the entire time of the Old Testament. They didn't leave when Joshua came in. Israel and the Canaanites, they kind of intermingled. And they maintained their own communities. In some cases, they intermarried. In some cases, Canaanites became absorbed into Israel, like any ethnic group becomes absorbed into another ethnic group. In some cases, I imagine Israelites went the other way. You'd have to imagine that. But it's a broad-based indigenous term for the people who live there. If you would have asked them, are you a Canaanite? They wouldn't have said yes. They would have given you their little local tribal name. And all these names, for the most part, are lost to us. Little individual names. But the umbrella term is Canaanite for all of them. It's like saying Native American. That's an umbrella term, right? There's a lot of subgroups and groups of subgroups. The word itself, Canaan, was the term that the Egyptians used for the indigenous people living there. That's an Egyptian term, actually. And the Bible people just adopted the Egyptian name that they were using for the land, Canaanites. So, in terms of ethnicity, broad-based Semites. Who are the Canaanites today? They disappeared over time. They were absorbed into other people groups, into Babylonians, into Assyrians, into Greeks, into Romans, into whatever. And it's not possible today to identify somebody as a ethnic Canaanite. You can't do it. It's the people, they've disappeared. Like the Philistines, they've disappeared into the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites. All these groups have disappeared into just a larger mass of people of the Middle East. The Jews have not disappeared, but the others have, yes. Right. Right. The typically when I've worked through this talk in other contexts, and I would say when I pause just about the spot that we ended before dinner tonight and ask for questions, I would say 98% of the time the question is, what about the land of milk and honey? That's the question that naturally comes up. And it actually leads to the second half of what I hope to get to, but we ran out of time. So I think that what we'll do is tomorrow during the service, rather than a formal sermon, it will be Taylor and I doing a question-answer. And that'll be one of the topics I think that will come up, and I'll try to say some brief things about it then. So maybe I won't say anything else now to make sure that you come to church tomorrow. And if not, it's probably you can find it online. But it's It's, I think, a term that can be explained several ways, and I maybe like one of them better that I'll mention, yeah. But it doesn't contradict what I said. Yeah. Okay. Other questions or comments, or should we have at it? Yes. Canaanite? No, the term is not that early. The term Cain and Abel was before we had these terms. Well, before there were other people as well. The term is not related to Cain, no. In English, it maybe sounds the same, but it's not the same name, no. Interesting, when we look at the archaeology, when we excavate Canaanite sites, all right, I didn't mention this last night. We could have gone there, but we chose not to. When we excavate Canaanite sites, and there are many of them in the land of ancient Israel, and there are others up into Phoenicia, Lebanon today as well. When we excavate these sites, we find that the Canaanite material culture is quite superior to the Israelite material culture. They had better stuff. They had finer, the pottery was nicer, the clothing, whatever is remaining, the weapons, the way the cities were built, the stuff they have, the material culture better than the more sophisticated, you might say, in their way of being, their way of living. And that was one of the attractions that pulled the Israelites away from themselves into the more superior culture. In other words, you leave Egypt behind, and you find out that the Canaanites are also pretty sophisticated and nice and successful in what they're doing. And so you've got sort of, you leave the one, but you haven't left it away. It's at home, the same problem, actually. It's the same problem you left. And it wasn't just the criticism that the Canaanites are pagans worshiping other gods. That's the reason that the biblical writers didn't like it. But the biblical writers don't say, oh yeah, we recognize you're going over there because the culture actually is easier, it's more sophisticated, it's more shiny, it looks better. That part's not talked about by the biblical writers. They just talk about the downside of being a Canaanite. So it's a lot of aspects to it, yeah. All right, I think it's a little bit after 6, and we have one more session on this one. Taylor asked me to say some things on the modern Israeli and Palestinian conflict, Israel-Palestine conflict. Like our other two sessions, rather than giving you a lot of specifics about what's happening today, you can sort of read the newspapers. Instead, I want to give you maybe some broader things that will help set what's happening today into context. By the way, about what's happening today, I find it helpful to go to a number of different kinds of news sources. You all know good and well that the Fox and the MSNBC tend to be on two different sides of pretty much any issue that there is there. If you look at Fox News and you look at MSNBC, within minutes of each other, look at both sites online, and you'll say, not only is it a different take on stories, it's different stories completely that they're talking about, for the most part. It's like different worlds they're living in. And if we look at only one, okay, we can reinforce what we believe, or we can, if we choose to look at only the other one, we can always be really angry about somebody else. And so what I do every morning, or whenever I check Fox, I check CNN, I check BBC, and I check MSNBC. I look at all of them to kind of see what's happening around here. And then I check the Jerusalem Post website, which is a conservative Israeli website. I check the Times of Israel, which is a a little bit more to the left of an Israeli website. I check the Jordan Times, which is news out of Amman, Jordan, and I check Al Jazeera, which is the Islamic news. And I look at all of them to see what they're saying. And partly because I want to hear kind of the breadth of it, and I like to see what the take is back and forth on it. And I feel that I don't need any of them to make up my mind. But I like to hear what all of them have to say. I think it's valuable to hear what all of them have to say. So, whether that's something that you would find valuable or not, I'll leave that up to you. But I think it's important when we look at something as difficult as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well. Back 40 years ago, when Diane and I were living in Jerusalem for the first 2 years that we were there, and there was a different set of struggles going on. It wasn't quite as widespread as the trouble is right now. It wasn't quite as widespread. And we would get our news from the radio, and we would tune into both an Israeli news station and like an Arab. They're all in English, but an Arab-based Israeli station. And when they would mention something that happened, it was predictable language. The Israeli station, terrorists, in response to known terrorists, the Israelis went in and took out terrorists in a military site. And the very same story on the other side. The Israelis came in and destroyed innocents in a children's center. Very same story. It's just how you choose to want to define populations and what was happening. And I think a lot of that is still going on, actually, which means where is the truth? And it's probably both and. But it doesn't get translated over here in the media very well. A lot of that's intentionally. And by the time the event happens and the media talks about it, and you hear about it and tell your friend, and they decide to protest for one side or the other, it's like 5 degrees of separation as to what was a murky truth to begin with. So it's hard. I understand that. At the same time, I don't want to minimize or excuse or set aside some real atrocities that are happening, and that there is a lot of evil going on in the Middle East right now. There's a lot of just evil stuff happening in the Middle East. In the middle of the sort of unrest on both the national and personal level, and the instilling hatred for the other already among preschoolers, so that we make sure they grow up hating the other, going on. Informal curriculum, already hating the other at that young. In the middle of all of that, we just have to say, what is the role of the church, and what is the role of believers in Jesus to speak into that situation, not just for believers in this land speaking in, because we're the foreigners, but the believers in Jesus who are Israeli passport holders with Jewish identity, and the believers in Jesus who are Arab, West Bank, Palestinian or Jordanian passport holders who are Arab identity, some of whom came from Muslim families. All of them believing in Jesus. What is their responsibility to find peace and to be spokesman for Jesus in the middle of that? And that's a hard job. It's a hard place to be. It's a very hard place to be in it. This particular picture that you see here is taken on Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, which is celebrated every year on the day that the Israeli IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, during the Six-Day War, June of 1967, some of you remember that, for some of you that's ancient history, but June of 1967, were able to go into the old city of Jerusalem, and verbs are always funny to use, but conquer, occupy, take, bring back. You can use whatever verb you want, so that Jerusalem then becomes under the control of the Israeli government rather than the Jordanian government. It becomes, all of Jerusalem is now unified under the Israeli flag. That happened in June of 1967, and every year on the anniversary of that, Israelis march for 2 days. It's a 2-day holiday called Jerusalem Day, and the parades holding Israeli flags, marching in Jerusalem, especially in the areas that became Israeli, areas that were Jordanian, areas that are Palestinian / Arab / Jordanian / Muslim / not Israeli Jewish, those areas. Especially, and this is one of those neighborhoods. You can see the minaret, so passing a mosque, and the police come out. You see the barricade in the front. All the police barricades have the Hebrew and the English, so that if you're a tourist, you know what it is, right? And the police then allowing on a main street in East Jerusalem, Arab East Jerusalem, Palestinian East Jerusalem, the parade to take place. And we got caught up in this thing, and as I was walking through, decided to take some pictures, and most Arabs who live in these buildings, in the house, out of the way, a few walking quietly, just trying to not be obscene and observed, as the throngs of mostly young people, Israelis, celebrating the unification of the city under Israeli control. So that's an annual reality and symbol of sort of, it's right here. It's right here. It's meant to be in your face by both sides. It's meant to be in your face. We are here. We are here too. Right now we're hiding. We don't want to hide anymore. We want you gone. These kinds of things always erupt on days like this. The modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let me give you some data points. And this is the kind of discussion, actually, that if you have questions, I don't mind, just stick your hand up. And I can either clarify or I can say, we'll get to it in a minute. I don't want to go too far down too many rabbit trails, because it's the kind of topic that actually takes many sessions to work through. We'll just do a little bit as we go. So let's click to the next one. And just put this into perspective. Often these kinds of questions come up. Well, who started this conflict? So like today we could say it started October 7th, 2023, when Hamas broke through the wall of Gaza, the fence of Gaza, and came and did some very atrocious and awful things. There are not English words strong enough to describe what Hamas did to Israeli civilians on that day. And so you can say they started it. But if you ask others, they will say, but they wouldn't have done it if Israel wouldn't have done something first. That was not a start, that was a response to a previous event. So who started it? When did it start? What caused it? Or if you want, who caused it? Why are they fighting anyway? And when and how might it end? And that's the big question right now. When and how might it end? And it's not getting any easier day by day, actually. When and how, and in terms of on-the-ground struggles, it's lasted much longer than anybody expected it to. War of Independence, Israeli War of Independence, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, these things lasted just days or weeks. This is a prolonged struggle on the ground that seems to just be getting more and more intransigent as it goes. So it's not possible to address the last question, when and how it might end, without first tackling the range of answers to the first four questions. And depending on who you ask, there could be various answers to the first four questions. Depending on which Israeli Jew you ask, there could be more than one answer. Depending on which Arab Palestinian you ask, there might be more than one answer. All right? These are not two unified fronts. They're two very diverse fronts coming together at various points. So next slide. Let me start by this. According to the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law, wow. Currently, as of this moment, there are more than 114 armed conflicts in the world. You think Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine. I can't think of a third one. Currently, there are more than 114. 45 in the Middle East and North Africa alone. Cyprus, Egypt, Iraq, Israel, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Palestine, Syria, Turkey, Yemen, Western Sahara, to name just a few. Over 35 in Africa, over 21 in Asia, 7 in Europe, 6 in Latin America, and the armed conflict that is currently happening has for a number of years now with the most casualties. The one with the most casualties is in, are you ready for this? Mexico. The Mexican government against drug lords and others on the other side of the border. Hence, people want to get out of there and come this direction instead, to the gentle rolling hills of Iowa and other places instead, to get out of that place. All right? So why do we spend all the time talking about Israel-Palestine? That's a question we should ask as well. What is it that makes the news focus so much on Israel-Palestine and totally ignore South Sudan or Bangladesh or Myanmar or other places? You know, places we don't care about. Not that we shouldn't. And that's one question to begin with, and I don't have a good answer of it. You know, people can rip each other's heads off in eastern Bangladesh, but if somebody sneezes in Jerusalem on the wrong side of the street, it's international news. Okay, it's more than sneezing now, but you get the idea, right? And why is that? And an Israeli Jew will say, many Israeli Jews will say, it's because of worldwide anti-Semitism. And that does play a role. I don't know if it's the only answer. I don't know if it explains everything. Probably not. But there is persistent anti-Semitism in this world for lots and lots of reasons, and maybe that's another discussion. How come it's there, and what can we do about it? That we'll set aside for a minute. Prolonged anti-Semitism, and we just don't like those people. All right? Maybe it can be explained as well. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so you're going to the question, when did it start, actually? Anti-Semitism is from you've got it in Greco-Roman writers already 2,000 years ago. Very, very, very nasty anti-Semitism already, and you can trace it back before that. But certainly, and we'll get to this, hopefully today, certainly we could say that because of the experience that Jews in Europe had under the fist of Nazi Germany, that the Jews deserve some kind of counterbalance of having a place where they can live safely and securely without having to deal with anti-Semitism at home. Hence the state of Israel being theirs. You can argue that. I think that I would agree with that. Again, it doesn't explain everything why there's a state of Israel, but that's certainly a strong element in it. So when you get to your home and want to live in a safe and secure environment without anti-Semitism, and you find out it's still here. The same way that when ancient Israel left Egypt and went into Canaan, they met people who were like the Egyptians. They're still here. You don't get away from it simply by going home. The problem is bigger than that. It's bigger than that. Let's see. So, another reason perhaps is because of this book. You know, whether we believe this book or we don't, whether we are Semitic or not, whether we still, the Judeo-Christian ethic based on the reality of the Bible as a document has given many people in the world, not just Westerners, not just Americans, also people living all over the world, a common identity, a common shared awareness of who we are. And so even though I'm able to, my father used the internet. You can find anything you want on the internet, right? He found ancestors of ours that go back before Columbus in England. So as far as we go back with my ancestry, and it's like 15 generations, not one drop of Jewish or Semitic blood whatsoever. So what? I still have an identity in that land. I still have an identity with God's chosen people. It's not blood-based. It may be grafted in. Use the term you want. But because of that connection, lands of the Bible are always going to be headlines in America. Always. Even for people who are non-believers, there's still something in that land that's interesting and sort of bumps it up to the top of the headlines in the news. So we'll keep that in mind as we go. I don't know, do Israelis like being front page news? Not always. Not always, but they are. Let's look at the next one. A number of years, this is a map. Back in 1997, Jimmy Carter's Secretary of State, Zbigniew Brzezinski, maybe some of you remember that name. Brzezinski followed Kissinger. One was German, one was Polish. Neither one of them spoke English perfectly, if you remember them speaking. But Brzezinski wrote a book both of them were college professors. Both of them interested in geopolitics. And in 1997, this is before 9/11, by 4 years, he wrote a book called the Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperative. That's a fancy title. The Grand Chessboard, and looked at the entire world as a chessboard with the two main players. America, representing the West, and Russia, representing the communist world, Russia-China, representing the Eastern Bloc China world, communist world as it worked its way out of the Soviet Union, and the two of them using the rest of the map of the world as these spaces where they were moving pieces. And has some very interesting maps, the way he draws lines and things of areas and zones of conflict. And this thing, you see, which goes from Russia through Kazakhstan all the way down to Sudan and Yemen, including Turkey all the way over to Pakistan, the global zone of percolating violence, he calls it. This is 1997. 4 years later, of course, 9/11, and the whole world turned to this zone to try to figure out what was happening. But it was stuff that was already doing this bubbling as we go. And Israel-Palestine, one important hotspot all the way through this zone. One of many. You see all the stars on here, areas of unrest, conflict, and violence back in 97. I don't think you need to take any of those stars off. It's still conflict all the way through. Just again to have a larger perspective of where we are here. You know, as the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, as the Khomeini, the Ayatollah in Iran, as as the head of Turkey, as the head of Syria and Egypt, some of these countries, they're jockeying for position among themselves. Don't think it's all of them against Israel. They're jockeying for position among themselves for supremacy in this big oval. Trying to figure out, should Israel be part of the solution, or does Israel need to be erased for the solution? Don't think Israel needs to be erased is for the solution is the only suggestion that these guys are making. How can they be part of us? What can we do? Which one of us is going to... And how can we have living space and keep the big cat away, Russia? How can we do that? Or maybe we want to snuggle up to the cat. How can we do that? Anyway, next slide. All right, here are some Israeli claims. Common Israeli claims in the current conflict and in the years leading up to the current conflict. All right, common Israeli claims, things that you would hear the Israelis say, Israeli Jews say. Number one, there is a biblical mandate for our independent rule in the land. God put us here. All right? And wants us to stay here. God, we've been absent. We've come back. God wants us here. All right? I don't think I have to explain this one. We talked about it last session, among other things, right? Number two, there is historic continuity. It's not just God wants us here. Even an Israeli Jew who is secular, and here's a surprise, more than half of the Israelis are atheists today. They're secular. Their claim on the land is not because there is a God who put us here. Their claim on the land is we have a Bible that is part of our national religious heritage. Our people in the past might have believed in God. I don't. They might have. Good for them. But because they were here, we need to stay. We need to stay. So there's historic continuity. Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes, the story you have it here. God changed his name to Israel. So Israel is a very old name, all the way back, Genesis 32. It's an early name. It's an origin name of the people. All right? And the word Jew actually is a form of, an accent of, the word Judea or the word Judah. Judah. So when we talk about Jews today, we tend to equate them with all of the Old Testament people, Israel. That's actually what we call an anachronism. It's reading backwards. The Jews today, most of them, if you did the DNA, coming from the tribe of Judah, from the tribe of Judah. It's incorrect to say that David was a Jew. David was an Israelite of the tribe of Judah, which started to call themselves Jews half a millennia after David died. You don't have the word Jew until the return from exile. So if you want to be clear, you should say David the Israelite or David the Judean. You can't say David the Jew. You can say Ezekiel the Jew. Ezra the Jew, and Nehemiah the Jew, and Esther the Jew, because they were after the return from exile. Before that, you can't. People say Abraham the Jew. That one for sure you can't say, because he was the he was the grandfather of Israel, who was the father of Judah, who 1,000 years later you can have the word Jew. You see what I mean? So we have to be careful in terminology as we speak. If somebody says David was a Jew, they're betraying an ideology that says there is a certain kind of continuity between the Israelite kingdom and the modern state of Israel that I want to emphasize. All right? Okay, you understand the energy behind the comment. Energy behind the comment. Also, archaeological remains. Israelis will excavate at places within the state of Israel, within the West Bank, Palestinian areas, within Gaza, within the Golan Heights, which is toward an area that had belonged to Syria before 1967. They will find remains of sites, excuse me, remains in, whoops, Diane, run in and get me some more water. They will find, thanks, remains and sites of Jewish activity here prior. Synagogues, rock stones with Hebrew writing on them. At sites in Syria, in sites in Lebanon, in sites in the Gaza area, in the Sinai, outside the normal borders of the modern state of Israel. Jews lived there earlier in antiquity, in the time of the New Testament and before. And they say, see, that shows that we were here and that we had a presence in the land. Okay, the next one. Here's a word I'll teach you. Same slide. Go back. The number 4 next one I meant number 4. Topological continuity. Everybody say that in one breath. Topological continuity. What that means is the topos, the place name. It means the name of the place is preserved. So when you look then at the names of the places mentioned in the Old Testament where people lived, I don't mean just Jerusalem. I mean the villages. I mean the small places. Great, thank you. The villages, the common villages all over the land. We have hundreds of place names mentioned here in Hebrew. And when you walk around the land, you find Muslim Arab villages scattered across what is now modern Israel plus the West Bank that have preserved, the name of their village is the same name as it was when Israelites lived there 3,000 years ago. The name is pronounced differently because of the Arabic rather than Hebrew pronunciation, but the name is the same. The name is the same. It's not a Muslim name. It's a Hebrew name spoken in Arabic. Right? There are hundreds of examples of this. All right? An common Israeli claim would say that's significant. It means we were here. And common Israeli claim would be Jerusalem undivided, east and west. The Arab part, the part that used to be Jordan, the part that has Palestinians in it, the western part, the Israeli Jewish part, they belong together as an undivided city. Undivided Jerusalem is our capital. Another common Israeli claim, and this one gets at the World War II event. The world owes us a safe place to be. We deserve it from what we've been through the last 2,000 plus years. The heart and soul of the world owes us a safe, secure location so we don't have to be bothered when we're here. And the last bullet point, you'll hear this one or something like it a lot. We, Israel, were the only free, democratic, tolerant, innovative, you can add other words if you want, country in the Middle East. The Middle East needs us. America needs us as an ally in the Middle East. We're the only one like you, an Israeli will say. All right? And these are very strong points, actually. And we could probably add a few more. But these are the common ones that you will hear from an Israeli. Now, what will a Palestinian say? A Palestinian in the same land. Let's look at the next picture. Common Palestinian claims. We are the native population of the land. They won't say God put us here. That's not the language. We are the native population of the land. And here it's the land during the great Jewish diaspora for the last 2,000 years until 1948. A land that indigenous people, whatever you want to call them, it's no longer the word Canaanite working here, Arab, if you want, living here in the land in the late 1800s, in the early 1900s, following the Second World War. All you Jews came from someplace else. You're the new ones coming. You're the arrivals coming in here. You took our land. We were here first. We are here first. We are her first. In regard to the world owes us Israel a safe place? Come on. This was Europe's problem. Hitler was European. He was not Middle Eastern. You were living in Poland and Germany and France and Luxembourg and Belgium and Holland, you Jews. All right? Listen. You had a problem with Hitler. Hitler is gone. It's Europe. Solve the problem, Europe. Don't throw it over to me. Don't make your problem mine, a Palestinian would say. Find a place in Europe for you guys to be. All right? Common Palestinian claim. The word Palestine comes from Philistia. You see, we were here a long time ago. The word Palestine does come from the word Philistia, actually. It does. It does. The Philistines were here when the Israelites first came in under Joshua. There were already Philistines here. They were not Canaanites, another people group. And that prompts us to ask the question, well, how come the Palestinians are called Philistines? What's that? Is that significant? Is that an important thing? Is that an important thing? And let me just give you a couple quick sub-bullet points on it, all right? The Philistines were Greeks. They were Indo-Europeans. They were not Semites. They were Greeks. And they came to the land when the Greek cat got sick and died. And some of their people fled for a new land, the Minoan civilization, if you want the ancient term for the Greeks. And they settled up on the coast there. They settled up on the coast from, let's say, Tel Aviv down to Gaza today. They settled up on the coast, and they dug in the same time Israel came in from the east and started to dig into the hill country. And so much of the biblical narrative is the Israelites and the Philistines struggling, a mouse fight, but struggling for control of the better part of the land of ancient Israel. The line of the coast is the better part. Better resources, better water, better soil, better routes, better ports, better cities. That's where the Philistines set up shop. The Israelites were up in the hills that had the disadvantaged resources. And David, Solomon, and everybody else wanted to come down and bump the Philistines out so Israel could have the entire area from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. From the river to the sea, if you want to use pick up a term that you hear in the news today. Yeah, for Israel to have that, which they did have it during the time of some of the kings. The Philistines remained. They were never driven out completely. They remained so that when Rome entered the land, and they're coming in from the Mediterranean, right? And as you're coming into the Middle East, approaching that eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean Sea, Romans, you're coming in, the first people you meet on the shore are historic Philistines. And so with your Latin or Greek pronunciation, we've landed in Palestine, Philistia. That's what they labeled the land. And then they simply, because that's the front door to a country that goes up into the hill country, Jerusalem, down to the Dead Sea and beyond, we'll just call the whole thing Palestine. Because that's the doorway as we entered. That's the doorway. So the Roman name was Palestine for the land. The Romans didn't actually officially call the land Palestine locally until after Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in the year AD 70, toward the end of the New Testament. All during the New Testament, the Roman official name was the old name, Judea. So to say that Jesus lived in Roman Palestine is also an anachronism. Jesus lived in Roman Judea and Galilee. And only after then Rome officially annexed, removed the Jewish kingdom, and officially annexed the land and made it a formal, high-level Roman colony, they went back to that first name that they saw, Palestine, and said, now the whole thing is Palestine. But that's not until the 2nd century A.D., when the church has already spread all the way to Rome and beyond. And that name stuck. The Greco-Roman name stuck until today. Until today. When the British had the land, after the First World War, 1917 until 1947, the British controlled, as the outcome of the First World War, as the Turkish Ottoman Empire was carved up, that corner of the Ottoman Empire came under British control, and the British officially called it Palestine. They picked up the same name, and everybody living there, whether you're Arab, Jewish, Western, immigrant, whatever, everybody had a Palestinian passport, including people like David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir and all the founding fathers of the modern state of Israel. Prior to 1967, they had a Palestinian passport. All right? Now that they have Israeli Jewish passports, the local indigenous Arab population, and we have to get to this yet. If we don't get to all of it today, we can pick it up next time I come, all right? The local Arab indigenous Taylor, where are you? I just invited myself back, all right? The local Arab indigenous population is simply retaining that ancient name, saying, no. Palestine is Philistia. We were here first. Who was here first? When did the fight start? You see these questions? Where do you want to draw your line in the sand? Where do you want to do it? The Palestinians will say, yeah, we are the native population. We were driven from our homes by the Israeli army and by the settlers and a formal Israeli government policy. And I can show you maps of Palestinian towns, entire towns, hundreds of them, that no longer exist in modern Israel for, well, again, depending on which side you're on, for war reasons, for strategic interests, for colonizing, for it depends on which side you're on, which verb you use. All right? The Israelis are colonial, and that word is used a lot by Palestinians. Colonial occupiers who oppress us as second-class apartheid people. This word is this phrase is very common among Palestinians describing their right and identity into the land. We have the right to exist as an independent people in our historic homeland. That's what the Israeli Jews say on the previous slide. We have a right to exist as an independent people in our historic homeland. The next to the last bullet point, our refugees have a right to return to their homes. In these destroyed villages, they're in Israel today. We have a right to go back, they would say. These are our homes. And then you have to ask other questions. Other questions. What's the right of warfare? What does the right of being a victor in war entail? Normally, you control the land. Why should you let anybody else back? How come this has to be a special case? What, you mean the normal rules of warfare don't apply here? And they do in South Sudan and Bangladesh and every place else? You see. It gets complicated really fast. Our refugees have a right to return to their homelands. And Jerusalem is our capital. What do you mean it's your undivided capital? It's our capital. Most Palestinians today would say, let's divide it the way it was before 1967. We'll be happy with the eastern half. Most Israelis say no, it has to be united. Not all of them, but most of them. And so you have common claims. And you can see we use some of the same methodology for each, don't we? And how do you reconcile them? How do you reconcile them? Next slide. Both the Israelis, Israel, and the Palestinians consider the conflict to be an existential fight. There's a big word. What do I mean by existential? One of existence. of existence. Not just the right to have national sovereignty, although that's part of it, to have national sovereignty, but the right to exist safely and securely as a people. And the best way to do that is to have national sovereignty. Both people say the same thing. And that should raise a lot of other questions in your mind. What about at what point does a people group have the right to say we should be independent in terms of sovereignty? And you can think of probably lots of people groups in the world who don't have or never had sovereignty. Don't they have a right to? Or maybe there are people groups who should be split into 2 nations. Yeah? Make California 5 different states. You've seen that one, right? Maybe we fought a war in this land. We fought a war back in, my great-grandma was born during that war. It was fought between the northern and the southern states, right? About should we be 2 or who says we have to be 1? My rights are best protected if I have my own independent country, not yours. And it's sort of at that level here, actually. It's sort of at that level. To exist safely and securely as a people. Do we need, and we should ask, do you need to have? Now, does God want you to have, is the method for security and safety nationhood? Or are there other methods to have that? You see, I'm asking questions, I'm not answering them. But I'm asking questions. I'm asking questions. Do we have a right? The Kurds don't have their own state. They would like it. The Armenians didn't for a long, long time, and now they have their own nation with the breakup of the Soviet Union. The Alawites don't have their own country. Have you heard of the Alawites? They're in North Syria. What compensates is the head of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, is an Alawite. He's not a Muslim. He's an Alawite. Well, an Alawite is a cultic Muslim. He counts himself as Muslim, but he's a kind of a minor offshoot. Right? He's in charge of Syria, so that's good enough. Right? At what point? At what point? At what point do the Native Americans deserve national sovereignty today? And the U.S. government is still wrestling with that one. And how about if we give you this much more? This much. You can have tribal councils. We'll kind of count you as a sovereign nation. But we really don't. What do you do with Palestinians within Israel? 1 Kings 4:25. And this is a verse that the Israelis would like to go back to. 1 Kings 4:25. It's a verse, one verse in a much longer set of verses and chapters that talks about the reign of King Solomon. After David expanded the borders of the land to include actually control over what is now, today, Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. After he pushed the borders of Israel back and Solomon controlled all of that, we read, among other things, in verse 25 of 1 Kings 4, Judah and Israel. The kingdom is united, but there's still an understanding that Israel and Judah are going to fall apart. So it says, Judah and Israel lived in safety, every one under his own vine and fig tree. In his own, today we would say, each one in his own home, with his own portfolio that allowed him to live a quiet and successful life. Lived in safety from Dan to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. And you know that when the Israelis have election for government, for members of the parliament, of the Knesset, and for who's going to be prime minister, several of the parties running will put out the slogan, if you vote for my guy, he will give you safety. And it's the biblical Hebrew word from this verse. You vote for my guy, and he will let you live in safety. A lot of that goes back to the Second World War. Just let us alone in our own country. We deserve it. The Palestinians say, but why here? That was a Europe problem, not mine. Next slide. Is the root cause of the fight more one of material rights, land, economy, resources, border, control of space? Or is it more one of ideological rights? God put us here. Allah wants me here. Religion, culture, expressions of identity. We belong to the land. Which one is it? And you have a party in both among the Israeli Jewish population, growing, mostly young people, strong. Religious nationalists. That's a powerful punch. Religious nationalists. Put them together. You've got the same in the Palestinians, mostly young, strong, growing, driven. Religious, want a nationalists, looking for that nation to put it together. When you put nationalism and religion together, it's very powerful. Also in this country. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just trying to describe it, okay? So don't get too upset. But it's when you put them together, it's a very powerful punch. Listen, the church I grew up in, the Evangelical United Brethren Church that I grew up in rural Illinois, small little corner. My grandfather gave the land so the building could be built, my great-grandfather. And up in the front, there were two flags. The American flag, it was on this side. The American flag and the Christian flag. You know the Christian flag? Of course it's red, white, and blue. It wouldn't be any other color, you see. Now, is that good or bad? Well, it is. What it is it is. And in Israel and in Palestine, it's supersized. You know, give me the extra value meal with a little extra on it. That's what you've got. Young folk on both sides really going at it. All right? The fusion of religion and politics, heart and brain, blood and soul. We are, after all, holistic people. We like to be that way. We like to be that way. I don't know how we can not be that way. But it's part of what energizes the fight. It's part of what energizes the fight. Okay, next slide. Here is a map. Okay, a little geography lesson. Here is a map. Oh, I can see we have this square around it as well. This happened, I guess, when I saved it on my computer. I don't know. Take these squares off. The big square, just take them off. Pretend they're not there. Wow. Pretend they're not there. Okay, this complicates it. Here is the same map that we had in the other session. All right? The same map we had in the other session. Israel, the bridge. Remember the land bridge? Israel, the bridge. Connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Indian Ocean. We had talked about continents, right? Europe and Asia with Africa. It also connects the Mediterranean Sea and all of what lies behind that. Europe, North America, massive economic opportunity, with the Red Sea that goes into the Indian Ocean, South and Southeast Asia, and the powerful economy that's there. Yeah? On the global scale. There are only 2 countries on the planet that have seaports on the Mediterranean Sea and on the Indian Ocean, let's say the Red Sea. On the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. On the, South Africa, I guess, way down there, but in terms of this part of the world. Egypt is one, and Israel is the other one. Right here to right here, that land bridge. Now that's a tremendous economic opportunity for the modern state of Israel. But what does it do to the land bridge, the continent bridge? From Asia to, from Africa to Asia, from Africa to Saudi Arabia, from the Muslims in Cairo to Mecca. No longer can do a landed pilgrimage because of an 8-mile wide, less than that, maybe 5-mile wide little cut that Israel controls. It's taken away the right to pilgrimage, and Cairo fashions itself as the chief Muslim city in the world. I can't get to Mecca anymore unless I fly or take the boat, but who wants to do that? I need the pilgrimage, like the same way that Muhammad did. It separates Cairo from Damascus. Syria and Egypt were, under Nasser, one country. It broke apart after 3 or 4 years. This is back in the 60s, right? The United Arab Republic, some of you might remember that one. Israel separates the two, divides the Muslim world. Another example, Israel the bridge or Israel the wedge, separating Africa from Asia and Arabia. Which is it? Is it a bridge connecting, or is it a wedge separating? And when you run modern geopolitics and economic supply lines, you have to think on that level as well. This is the practical side of it. The practical side of it. Here's another one. Up here is Damascus, Syria. All right? Damascus is behind two very tall and rugged mountain ranges, snow-capped, parts of them all year long. The Lebanese range and what we call the anti-Lebanese range, which are in Lebanon, ancient Phoenicia. Damascus is here. Damascus is a very ancient city that controls the camel caravan trade route from the Persian Gulf, Mesopotamia, down to Egypt, the very ancient route. But Damascus, whoever's controlling Damascus, also very badly wants to have a Mediterranean connection. Now today, Syria, you can do that way up here at a place called where Antioch was, Syrian Antioch in the book of Acts. They have a way to get out up by Turkey. But the direct way for Damascus, up and over these mountains in Lebanon, very, very difficult. You'd rather south and right through, there's a flat corridor right through here, through the Jezreel Valley. That's Damascus's claim to the Mediterranean. Right through the Galilee, right through what is today northern Israel. And Israel then, during the Six-Day War, took this whole section of Syria in order to make sure Damascus stays back and doesn't have the run through their land. This is only 30 miles. If Syria controls this, a very quick shot, before you know it, they've cut off Israel's northern lifeline. So instead, what do? We're not going to conquer Lebanon per se, but we sure are going to act like it's ours, which is what you have a fact on the ground today. We'll kind of force our way through the mountains with modern bulldozers and tunnel-making equipment and all kinds of stuff, and we'll make Lebanon our port to the sea instead. Iran says, I want a part too. Okay, come on in. Come on in. Next slide. Nations acting like people. Nations acting like people. You know, Israel the person, Jacob, the guy you read about in Genesis. Have you read those stories lately? Genesis 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, those chapters about Jacob? I'll tell you, the guy who God said, I'm going to make your name Israel. You're going to be the father of the 12 tribes. So have you read those stories lately? Read them with care in terms of how he acted as a person. He was kind of a rascal, that guy. Deceiver. Deceiver. The word Jacob. Where does it come from? In your Bibles, it will say it means deceiver. But it's something else. It comes from something even more basic than that. You all have two of them on your body. It's your heel. The word Jacob comes from a noun that means heel, the heel of your foot. And the idea is, if you're trying to overpass somebody, get in front of them, supplant them, and they're walking in front of you, just stomp or step on their heel as they're trying to walk. And they'll be tripped up without even knowing what happened. They don't even have to see you. It's not like you're elbowing them so they can look you in the eye. Just right behind them, step on the heel, they'll stumble, you can keep going, you've made it. That's the word Jacob. That's the word Jacob. All right? And God says, let me change your name. Let me change your name. I'm not going to change your personality. You are who you are. Let's just redirect it. And the story in Genesis 32 is, I'm changing your name. This is when Jacob wrestles with that guy. You know the story? Wrestles with, it says angel in Hosea, but wrestles with a guy. I'm changing your name to Israel. Israel means the one who strives with God, not the one who strives to be a deceiver, to overcome for your own good. Still strive. Just make sure you do it with God. And the rest of Jacob's history as a nation is the same story. Are you trying to strive for your own benefit or with God to create an environment where people can live really safely and securely? Which is it? Which is it? And are we any closer now than we have been then? I don't know. But the Bible becomes extremely personal. I have a feeling that if God would have chosen Ishmael rather than Isaac and his sons rather than Jacob, the rest of the story would be the same. Because you know what? People are people. The rest of the story would be the same. It wouldn't have changed. Israel the person, Israel the nation. The rest of the Bible actually describes the actions, the rest of the Bible describes the actions of Israel the nation as if Israel the person. And the prophets, the same way that a person would be scolded for certain behaviors, the prophets do that to the nation. Acting too much like it. Okay. Next slide. All right. Let's see. This one maybe is a little hard to see. This one is a little, let me give you some data points. Let me give you some data points. We're a little bit off. This one I think shows everything. Here it's not quite, it's a little bit bigger than the screen. Some data points. This is a map of the, let's say, the Middle East. All right, the Middle East. The X here, well, it's over a bit. Israel. That's our Israel-Palestine. This, yeah, that's better. Israel-Palestine, that's kind of our land between. That's kind of the, remember we saw the map in the previous section of the empires roundabout, and the arrows coming through, and so on. Now, what I'm giving you here are dates and places. So just bear with me for a minute, all right? Down here in Mecca and Medina, Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad, founder of Islam. And he was born probably around the year 570. He died in 632, Prophet Muhammad. And within about 30 years after he died, there was a lot of jostling for position, a lot of bloodshed. Islam was born on the edge of the sword, to be quite honest. A lot of jostling for position and authority. This land between, the land that is today Israel, Palestine, this land fell under the rule of a Muslim dynasty from Damascus, from 661 to 750, so about 100 years. This land was ruled by Damascus, Muslims from Damascus. They were followed from 750 to 975 for another couple of centuries by another Muslim dynasty from Baghdad, ruling this land. The cat ruling this land. A cat ruling this land. They were followed by another set of dynasties from Tunisia and Cairo. North Africa. Another set of cats, Muslim, ruling this land until the year 1171. All right? Then it became Crusader, ruled by a Christian cat from Europe for about 100 years. Then it became ruled by another Muslim cat from Cairo, 1250 to 1517. This is the time of Columbus, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, right? Ruled by another Muslim, the Mamluks from Cairo. And then from 1517 until 1917, the end of the First World War, by another Muslim dynasty cat from Constantinople, now Istanbul, the Ottoman Turks. And from 1917 to 1948, by the British, another cat. So from the rise of Islam until 1948, this land, Israel, Palestine, was ruled not internally, but by somebody else. For almost 1,500 years. Never ruled locally. Always ruled by somebody else. All right, is that clear? Clear. Now, next slide. If we back it up from Muhammad, let's go backwards from Muhammad. And I'm not giving you dates, I'm simply giving you names. Before Muhammad controlled this land, before the Muslims did, for 20 years it was Persian, then it was Byzantine Christian, then it was Roman, and then you have about 100 years where it was freedom, independent Jewish state under the Maccabees. And then before that it was Greek, before that it was controlled by the Persians, before that it was controlled by the Babylonians, before that it was controlled by the Assyrians, and before that, Israel and Judah, independent states, Israelite states. And by the way, that's when we first have the word Arab, during the time of the Israelite kingdom. And the Arabs are Bedouin. They're desert, camel, goat, sheep, tent people only, the Arabs. That's the term used for them. The earliest use of Arab are the Bedouin, the movable camel caravan guys. Before that, it was Egyptian and Canaanite. In terms of control, almost always foreigners, cats. Rarely, almost never indigenous. And the only time it ever was governed independently, indigenously, when the Jews had an independent state under the Maccabees for 100 years prior to the New Testament, and during the years of Israel's monarchy, and before that when it was independent Canaanite city-states ununited. But each city-state just did its own thing. All right? When was there an independent Palestine? Never. Never. Now, does that mean the Palestinians shouldn't have an independent state today? No. But you can't base it on we had one once, because they didn't. Should the fact that Israel had an independent nation under the Maccabees and under the kings of Israel and Judah, is that enough to say that they should have an independent state today? Maybe. Depends on who you ask. Depends on what your end times theology says. And there's a lot of debate on that one as well, you see. So we're trying to fish for something, yes? That's right. Under the British mandate, British authority. But it's not an independent state. It's British mandate colonial Palestine under the British. That's a good question. It was not governed indigenously locally. It was under the British. And all across the empire, you know, they would say Uganda has a passport, but it's British issued. So there never was a Palestine government. Never was. Never was. Now, and the Israelis are very quick to say that, because there never was, there shouldn't be. And the Palestinians are saying, but just because there never was doesn't mean there shouldn't be, and we were here first in any case. We just finally, you owe us control finally after all these years. So which side are you going to come down on, you see? I want to emphasize this. We talk about the land being Roman or Greek or Persian or Muslim or whatever, all right? There was never a time when the land was only Roman, only Greek, only Muslim. Always had a mixed population, always. It was never ethnically pure, ever, ever. As most places are never ethnically pure. I can't think of a country anywhere that is just one type of people. I can't. And Israel, Palestine certainly today is not one as well. Next slide. So the British, in the middle of the First World War, 1917 rather, Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, pronounced this: His Majesty's government view with favor. Notice there's a U in the word favor, okay? View is British. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine. They're using the historic name. They're not saying this is an independent state. They're using the historic name. It's been used since 2nd century AD. Of a national home. Notice he doesn't say independent state. Diplomatic language can be very precise yet vague at the same time. If you want to be a diplomat, you really have to watch your words. Of a national home for the Jewish people. Notice he doesn't say Jewish state, people group. And will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by the Jews of any other country. It's this: nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. The Palestinian Arabs say, that's us. That's us. The existence of the modern state of Israel prejudices our civil and religious rights. We're not free. And Balfour said that we need to be free. And so the establishment of the state of Israel is a violation of the Balfour Declaration. And the Israelis will say the establishment of the state of Israel is exactly what the Balfour Declaration wanted to have. And you can read it both ways. You can read it both ways. By the way, the peace treaty, the Camp David peace treaty, remember Jimmy Carter at Camp David, Jimmy Carter, Anwar Sadat, and Menachem Begin. And they made peace with Egypt, Israel and Egypt, 1978, 1979. And the peace treaty was written in Arabic, it was written in Hebrew, and it was written in English. And guess what? They were not exact translations. The Arabic translation favored Egypt. The Hebrew translation favored Israel. Guess what? Guess what? We have from the 1200s BC a peace treaty between the Pharaoh in Egypt, Ramses II, and the biggest cat of his day, the king of the Hittites, modern Turkey. Made a formal peace treaty. And there's a copy of the peace treaty written, carved in stone in hieroglyphics in the Karnak temple in Egypt. I've seen it with my eyes. And there is a cuneiform, wedges on clay, in Hittite copy of that peace treaty in the museum in Istanbul. I've seen it with my eyes. The treaties are different. They favor each party. And they figure the other guy is never going to read it to know. This is what happens. This allows two different interpretations. So what do you do? Next slide. All right, I still got some time. Next slide. Now, throw on top of this the rise of nationalism. And if you can think now, your European history, end of the 1800s, as the age of empires, colonial England, colonial France, colonial Russia, colonial Italy, colonial Austria-Hungary. Europe was carved up into just a few countries. Just a few countries, and they all had interests overseas. And there was a rise of local people groups saying, we don't want to be governed by Germany or France or Austria-Hungary. We want to have our own government. Nationalism led directly to the First World War. Who shot the Archduke? It was the Serbian nationalists. End of June of 1914. The rise of nationalism. And the rise of nationalism in the 19th and early 20th centuries, in which colonial powers fostered various movements in the Middle East. These great empires in Europe, the Austro-Hungarians, Franz Joseph, the Germans, the rise of Germany in 1870s, the French, the Italians, the Russians, the Tsar Alexander the Third and Second, the British, Queen Victoria. They were all jostling for position in and around Jerusalem to see who is going to reap the benefit of controlling the Middle East when the big cat dies and goes away, the Ottoman Turks. And they were all, I can take you to Jerusalem and show you, they were all building different buildings in strategic spots as protecting the holy spaces, but all of these buildings could act as military forts when the big fight came. So this is the end of the early 1900s, prior to the First World War. Zionism. And by the way, the word Zion is not a Hebrew word. It's a Canaanite word. We don't know what it means. But it became a Israelite and then a Jewish term to describe this movement. Zionism was a nationalistic movement. It has become a religious nationalistic movement. Zionism was a nationalistic movement among atheist Jews in Europe and in Russia to find a homeland for the Jewish people in the late 1800s where we did not have to worry about pogroms by the Tsar or by the German nationalists or by the French in Paris. We need our own national movement. We need our own homeland. Ben-Gurion, Jabotinsky, all the early prime ministers, none of them were religious. None of them were. But they said, our heritage is here in this book of people who were religious. And we need to find their homeland back again. We need to be back there. Now, was God using that movement? Christians will say yes. Jews will say yes. Palestinians will say no. Does God use Cyrus, the pagan king, to bring Israel back into their homeland as a return from exile? Cyrus was a rank pagan. Isaiah called him Messiah, the anointed one, God's anointed one, who's going to use him anyway and bring Israel back. All right? Can we put Ben-Gurion in that category? Or is there something more than that? Something more than that. But Ben-Gurion tapped into a very strong understanding among people who do believe that God is bringing Israel back into the land. Tapped into it. Is he using religion for political gain? He wouldn't be the first one in the world who's done that, by the way, if he was. Or was it bigger than him? And God is going to say, you fool, I'm going to use you anyway. I'm going to make it happen anyway. Thank you for volunteering. I'm going to make it happen anyway. Arabism, in a variety of forms, is also a variety of nationalistic movements that erupted during and after the First World War. Their leader, in many ways, their leadership was a variety of people, but the face of Arab nationalism to the west The guy who kind of popularized it in the West, Arab nationalism coming out of the First World War, a guy named T.E. Lawrence. You know him as Lawrence of Arabia. And his goal, he was working with people in Saudi Arabia to establish independent Arab nation states as the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, pulled out. And when he was told by his queen, would have been king by then, Victoria is gone, by his king and his government, thank you for raising up the Arab revolt against the Turks. Our plan is to make them part of the British Empire. Lawrence was so upset with his own people because he had to go back and face the Arabs and say, it ain't going to happen. You're not going to have your nation states. Now, eventually they got them anyway coming out of the Second World War. But initially, no. Arab nationalism, very strong. Nationalistic movements, all of which have become more or less religious. The rise of Islamic fundamentalism in Iran is a hyper-religious nationalistic movement to bring Iran's government back to indigenous rather than Shah-oriented government, as an example. But these movements among the Arabs, they're not united. Once in a while, they'll come together for or against certain causes. The most common cause they've come together against is, what are these Jews doing here? They're supposed to be up in Europe if they want a state. But not all Arab governments are equally excited to get the Jews out. Jordan has made peace. King Abdullah in Jordan is trying very hard, recognizing that Israel is a friend, not a foe, for Jordanian interests. And the two can coincide. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is coming to the same point. Mohammed bin Salman is coming to the same point, where Saudi Arabia and Israel can be united for a stronger economic gain. Syria is not at that point. Lebanon is not at that point. Iran is not at that point. I don't know. Next slide. A very big complicating factor. Neither Israel nor the Palestinians are united internally on just about any criteria. And maybe let me show you some of these data points, and then we're about out of time. So the next slide. Israeli society today, Israeli passport holders, are divided on just about every issue. You have Ashkenazi versus Sephardic. Jews who came in from Central and Eastern Europe, from countries that we come from, and Jews that come from the Middle East and North Africa, who grew up in Muslim environments, who spoke Arabic. You know, the former president of Israel was born in Iran, in Tehran. Moshe Katsav, president of Israel, born in Iran. Ben Gurion was born in Belarus, or I think Poland he lived in for a while as well. Jews from the Middle East, Jews from Europe, and still in Israel, the Jews from the Middle East, from Europe, looked down on the Jews who came from the Middle Eastern countries, especially the Yemenites. Many Jews from Yemen in Israel today, and they're all looked down on. What's interesting is that the Jews from the Middle East actually preserve language, dialect, traditions, dress, costume, techniques, technology that's much closer to the biblical Jews than the Jews who grew up in Europe. They became much more Western. Secular versus observant. I already told you that over half of the Israeli Jews today are atheists, secular. And a variety of religious Jews, all the way from, I kind of go to synagogue once in a while, to very strict Mosaic law. In fact, there are some hyper-observant religious Jews today that do not accept the validity of the Israeli government. They say, God alone is going to give us our state. Not Ben Gurion, he was secular. We do not recognize the right of the modern state of Israel to be here. Observant Jews who say God alone gives us that right. and are praying for the downfall of the modern state so God can start again and bring back the temple, bring back the high priesthood, make the Orthodox Jews in charge instead. Throw that into the mix. Left versus right on all the criteria you have in this country. Left versus right. Urban versus rural on all the criteria you have in this country. Those living within the pre-1967 borders versus the settlers, the ones living on the West Bank. The ones the Palestinians called colonialists, apartheid colonizers. Jews versus minorities. Not every Israeli passport holder is a Jew. Less than 80% are Jewish. I think 73% are Jewish. The rest, mostly Arab. Israeli passport holders, Arab, but others. And some of these names you'll recognize, some you won't. But just so you can see, Circassians from the Caucasus, Druze, Armenians, you know the Kardashians, any name that ends in Ian, right? Armenians, Arameans, Syrians, Assyrians. There are still Assyrians, the northern end of the Fertile Crescent. Some of them are living in Israel. Alawites, Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, is an Alawite. There are Alawites living in Israel, Israeli passport holders. Copts, Egyptians, Samaritans. The guys you meet in the Gospel of John, Samaritans. There are still about 800 of them living in Israel. All right, we've met some of them. Baha'i, etc., etc., etc. And of the Arabs, most are Muslim. Of the Arabs, which is about 20% of Israel today, 97% of those Muslims Arabs are Muslim. About 3% are Christians. 3% of the 20% of the 100%. So a very small minority. And by Christian, I mean Greek Orthodox, I mean Maronite, Eastern Catholic, I mean Roman Catholic. Most of them, in terms of, let's say, Western Christianity, there are some Anglican, and in terms of what we might put under conservative, do you know the word evangelical Christianity, right? Maybe 6,000 people, 6 to maybe 16,000 people, we're not exactly sure, total, out of 10 million, 6 to 16,000 total. Some of whom are belonging to the Church of the Nazarene, among other missionary denominations. So it's a very mixed population. They're Israeli passport holders. Now, some of the Muslim Arabs are Shiite, some are Muslim, are Sunni, most are Sunni. Some are Shiite, Iranian Shiite. In Israel, passport holders. Next slide for Palestinian society. Palestinian society. I don't mean all of the Arabs of the Middle East. I mean those who call themselves Palestinians. All right? Mostly Sunni. Some are Christian. Secular or religious. The same way some are atheist. Functionally atheist. Functionally. Many are observant. Some are hyper-religious. Left versus right. Some hold a Palestinian ID card, passport. The Israelis are allowing the Palestinians on the West Bank, some of them, to hold Palestinian passports. They don't have a nation yet. They have Palestinian passports. Arabs on the West Bank. Some are holding Jordanian passports. West Bank was Jordan before Israel took it in 1967. There is, in Jerusalem, a special ID card that you can have if you are an Arab, non-Israeli passport holder with permission to live or work in Jerusalem. You have a Jerusalem ID. It's a separate kind of an identity paper. That's the one that's most coveted by the Palestinians because of job opportunities. Urban versus rural, tribal as well. Loyalties to the tribe, to the family, not to the government, not to the political party. Similar in Jordan. Let me tell you a quick anecdote. I've got 2 minutes here. A quick anecdote. We're in Jordan during national elections. And there were parties, political parties that were running within Jordan for the parliament, for the government. It's kind of a parliament that works underneath the king. The king is the government, but he has his parliament to kind of advise him and stuff. And the King Abdullah II in charge of Jordan. The parliament, all these parties were running, right? And so they were running and they were running and they were politicking and candidating, and then the election took place. Most of the people who won were not those of those parties. They were local heads of tribes and families. When push comes to shove in the ballot box, you vote for blood. You don't vote for some guy that you've never met but says he wants to represent you. You vote for the head of your tribe or your family instead. National election. National election in Jordan. The Palestinians the same way. And the native versus immigrant, guess what? I don't have a percentage, but many people today living in the West Bank or people who were in the modern state of Israel and became refugees and moved out when Israel took over in 1948 are not native Palestinians. They moved for economic reasons from Lebanon or Egypt or Saudi or Jordan and someplace else. And their family line just go back 2 generations. Oh no, we're Lebanese. Not Palestinian at all. But yet, because they fall today, their family, within those borders, we're going to fight for the Palestinians. They've become Palestinian the same way. I'm not American. My grandfather came on a boat from Sweden. You know? I had another set of great-great-grandparents who came from England and Germany before the Civil War. It's the same kind of deal, right? How long do you have to be there before you say, no, I'm American? Well, no, I'm Palestinian, they'll say. Where do you fall? Which Palestinian is fighting which Israeli? Over what? And then you get the loudest voice, who happens to be in Israel right now, Benjamin Netanyahu. For the Palestinians in Gaza, it happens to be Yahya Sinwar. For Hezbollah, we don't know who it is anymore because the Israeli missiles are getting to be too good at finding them, right? For the moment in Iran, it's the Ayatollah Khomeini, or that was the first guy, the Ayatollah. Which one? Representing who? And the loudest voice is usually the one that's gathering enough support to have the fight. Does that mean all of them want to fight? No. But all of them then become part of the fight, identified with it, and either aggressor or victim, depending on where it happens to be going. Where it happens to be going. So, as my dentist said yesterday morning, when Messiah comes. When Messiah comes. Which is interesting because talking to some of you, I already know some of you, we recognize there's something here end timesy about this. There's something here that feels end times about it when Messiah comes. And my quasi-observant Israeli Jewish dentist feels the same way. Feels the same way. So, what can we do? There's more we can talk about. I have more slides, but I think we have to hold it here. We have to hold it here. I've used all my time, Taylor. I've used it all. Come to church tomorrow. We may have some more questions.
For the online people, it might actually cut you off. I'm so sorry, online people. Bottom line is, if you didn't know, this is all really complicated. There's a lot of layers. I think one thing that would be really good that everybody walks away from this is more humble when it comes to the topic. Because I know that's what I walked away, because I thought I went into Israel and I was on the right side of the equation. My thinking was on the right side, and then I left and I'm like, ooh, I wasn't thinking even close to the whole picture. So it was very insightful. And I got pretty special treatment because Paul and Diane took me to places that not everybody got to go.
Let me add one thing to that if I could.
Yeah.
Okay, not to take your time, but our goal at the school that I was connected with and still am